What is up everyone? I'm Jason from JB Watch Mods. Welcome back to another watch building video. Now today I've got on the table a vintage inspired Pepsi GMT. Now I feel like these watches invoke a bit of a love-hate relationship. You either love that vintage style patinaed lume or you hate it. I'd love to hear your thoughts in the comments below. Are you yay or nay for vintage inspired watches? With that said, let's jump in and see how this one turns out. Okay, so the first thing we need to do to get this build underway is to fit the dial. But before we can do that, we need to fit this washer. Now this washer sits over the post on the movement underneath the dial. And its purpose is to hold tension on that GMT gear so it doesn't jump loose. The washer is a U shape and the bottom of the U needs to be touching the movement. Now this dial I've got is a prototype dial that I've used for several builds, which is why it's already got the dial feet cut off and the center hole has been enlarged for the GMT movement. So with those steps already taken care of, it's as simple as locating the dial feet into the movement and pressing it down so it sits flat all the way around the movement. Once our dial is fitted, the next step is to get the movement to 12 AM. Now to do this, we pull the crown out to the third position and wind the time over until the date wheel flicks over. Once that date wheel flicks over, we know we're at 12 AM and we can go ahead and set the hands. So being that we're using an NH34 GMT, the first hand that we're going to press on is the GMT hand. So we know we're at 12 AM on the movement, so we can go ahead and line this GMT hand up with the 12 o'clock marker. Once we get that hand pressed on, we'll remove the movement from the press and wind the movement over until that GMT hand returns to 12 AM. And at this point you should see the date wheel flick over. Now because the dial I'm using doesn't have any raised indices, it gives you a lot of clearance to work with when setting that GMT hand. A lot of the time when you're working with an NH34 movement, hand tolerances can be very tight, so using a flat dial with printed indices could be a good idea if you're just starting out. So next up we have our hour hand, which we again line up with the 12 o'clock marker. Once we get that hand pressed on, we'll go through the same process and wind that movement over until the GMT hand returns back to 12 o'clock. What you're checking for here is that your hour hand clears the GMT hand and that the date wheel flicks back over when both your hands are at 12 o'clock. Now we can go ahead and press on our hour hand. We just repeat the exact same steps that we've done for the last two hands. And last but not least, our second hand. Now the second hand is the only hand that you can press on in any position. And that's due to the fact that this is a movement which has hacking, which means that when you pull that crown out, the second hand will stop. So you can effectively stop and start the second hand wherever you like. So now that we have all of the hands pressed on, we need to double check everything and make sure that everything is working correctly before we move on to the next step. So it's at this stage that I like to double check all of my clearances, and as you can see there, all of the hands clear each other nicely. We also want to make sure that our second hand is operating correctly and stops and starts with the operation of the crown. Now you may notice that there are a few marks and scuffs on the silver part of the handset, and I'm leaving them on there intentionally. Now normally I would grab my rotoco and clean those hands off so they're nice and perfect, but because I'm using a dial and handset that has faux patina on it, I'm going to keep those marks on the handset just because I think it adds to that vintage vibe. And while we're on that topic, I would love to hear everyone's thoughts in the comment section below about that fake patina look. What do you all think about that yellowish lume? Are you a fan or do you not like it? I would love to hear what you think in the comments below. Now it's time to prep this case to accept our movement and dial. Now to do this, we're removing our case back and case back gasket, and we're going to give this crystal a good cleaning. The tools that work best for me when it comes to cleaning the crystal is using an air blower and a lens pen. I've found over the years that this is all I need to get perfectly clean crystals. And before we pair the two together, just give that dial one last blow down to make sure that there's no dust or any debris on the dial. I'm also going to remove the crown before pairing it with the dial, as I've found that in some cases the crown will actually stick out and can scratch the dial if you're not careful. Now it feels like we're about halfway there and it's looking awesome. So now we can move on to the next step, which is going to be cutting the crown stem to the right length. Now I guess you could say I'm a little bit unconventional when it comes to my method of cutting the crown stem. The first cut I do totally by eye. I've done enough of these now that I've got a rough idea of the length it needs to be. So with that first cut made, I'm going to get my little Dremel and just smooth over the end of that cut, just to clean up the threads and make sure I don't risk cross-threading that crown. Then we can grab our crown, screw it on and get ready to test fit this in the case. And because we cleaned up the end of that thread, you can see that the crown screws on nice and easily. Now if you don't have a little Dremel, I'd recommend using a small file. So when you're first test fitting your crown, there's a couple of things that you want to look out for. You want to be able to screw the crown down flush against the case. If you can't do this, your crown stem is still too long. You also need to be able to pull the crown out to each position. And once the crown is pulled all the way out to the third position, you need to be able to push that crown back in. Once you can do all of these things, your crown is the perfect length. In my case here, the crown stem is still a little bit too long, as I couldn't screw the crown into the case. So I'm going to unscrew the crown, cut a little bit off the stem, and because I'm feeling confident that I've done it to the perfect length, I'm going to use my Loctite straight away just to ensure that the crown doesn't come loose unintentionally in the future. All you need is the smallest dab of Loctite just to keep everything together. And once you do screw that crown on, make sure you wipe off any excess Loctite with a bit of paper. So now we have our complete crown assembly. We can fit it to the case for hopefully the last time. And you can see here that the crown screws all the way flush into the case. Then we'll just double check to make sure that we can push in our crown and pull it out as well. Everything is looking good, so it looks like we can move on to the next step, which is going to be installing our case and our case back gasket. Before we install our gasket, we'll make sure that it's nice and lubricated by popping it into some silicone grease. This just helps to provide a better barrier against water penetration, and it also helps that case back to go on nice and smoothly. Once that gasket's lubricated, we can then pop it into the groove in the case. I've also been giving my case backs a quick clean before installing them, just by giving them a quick blowout and a quick wipe with the lens pen. But before we install our case back, this case uses a movement spacer. Now it's a small metal ring that sits above the movement once it's fitted into the case. It's simple to install and just holds the movement tight in the case once the case back is fitted. Now, not all cases require a movement spacer, but if the case that you're using comes with one, definitely use it. If it doesn't, don't stress about it. And once we've got that case back running by hand, we can grab our case back tool and lock it down all the way. But before doing that, I like to have a quick check just to make sure that the gasket is still in the groove in the case. Sometimes it can pop out, causing you to pinch the gasket when you lock it down with your tool. And there we have one completed watch assembly. Now we have our last minor steps, which are fitting the bezel insert and fitting our bracelet. So let's get on to the bezel insert. Now we're using an aluminium bezel insert, or aluminum as you Americans would say. Again, just because it adds to that vintage vibe of the watch. Now the bezel on our case already has the double-sided tape fitted, so all we need to do is remove that backing tape and we can stick the bezel insert down. I like to make sure that the bezel is rotated backwards just so it's in a firm position, and obviously being careful to line up the arrow with the 12 o'clock marker. I've said it before and I'll say it again, the bezel insert always completes the watch for me. It just transforms the watch and really brings the piece to life. Here I'm just using a microfiber cloth just to make sure that the bezel is firmly seated on that tape and isn't going to work its way loose anytime soon. Alright, but before we show this watch off too much, let's get this bracelet fitted. Now we're using a vintage style bracelet with a stamped clasp. I really love the way that these bracelets feel. Nice, light, and easy to wear. There's also micro adjustment in that clasp so you can really fine tune the fitment. And while we're on the topic, this case has drilled lugs as well, making it super easy for quick strap changes. But before we wrap this build up, if you're interested in picking a watch up like this for yourself, head over to my website, which is linked in the description, and you can check out my awesome range of watches. Or if you would prefer to build a watch like this for yourself, I'll leave all the links for the parts and tools needed in the description below. So now that this watch is just about done, let's flip it over, run some B-roll and see how this watch really looks. And there we have it, our vintage inspired Pepsi GMT. Now, like I said at the start of this video, I would love to hear your thoughts on that patina styled loom. What do you think? Personally, I go through stages with this loom. Sometimes I love it, sometimes I hate it. It just depends what mood I'm in. Now, if you've liked this video or gotten anything out of it, hit that like button, subscribe if you haven't, and I'll see you all in the next video.